Hawaii is finally opening for quarantine-free travel on October 15th. Aloha, fellow explorers. I'm Chris. This is Yellow Productions. I do travel guides that are fun, informative, entertaining, and we've got great news coming out of the state of Hawaii today. The governor has just announced their new Get Out of Quarantine travel program. So if you're planning a trip to Hawaii, you no longer need to quarantine for 14 days, provided that you meet the things that are outlined in the program. This program in its first phase is for travelers coming from the mainland of the United States of America, traveling to Hawaii. Travelers who receive a negative COVID-19 test result 72 hours prior to their arrival into the state of Hawaii will be able to enjoy their stay without having to do the mandatory 14-day government quarantine. And in this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about this new program. The first thing you need to know is where can you get tested? The state of Hawaii currently has partnered with two testing companies. Number one is CVS and number two is Kaiser Permanente. The state of Hawaii is currently contracting with more test vendors, but those other vendors have not been announced yet. When the state of Hawaii does announce new vendors, I will put them in the pinned comment in the comment section of this video. So if you're watching this in October, check out that pinned comment. The second thing to know is what kind of test is it and how is the testing gonna work? Well, first things first, once you've booked travel to Hawaii, then you will book an appointment through CVS, Kaiser, or one of the other testing providers. You'll need to have your appointment within 72 hours of your arrival in Hawaii, not your departure to Hawaii, but your arrival to Hawaii. The test performed will be a COVID-19 nucleic acid amplification test. Those are the tests where they put the swab in your nose. Now, one of the problems today in the US is that COVID-19 results are often taking more than 72 hours. They might take up to 5 to 7 days to get. Well, the state of Hawaii has said their goal with these contracted providers is for the providers to provide you, the traveler, the test results before you depart for Hawaii so that you can decide to cancel your trip provided that you test positive for COVID-19. Number three, who pays for the test? Well, at CVS, you certainly do, though the state of Hawaii has said that Kaiser is actually considering offering these tests free to Kaiser Permanente members. Will they? That's not sure yet. It hasn't been announced by Kaiser, but just something they're thinking about. Number four, what happens on arrival? Well, the state of Hawaii lays out three different scenarios. The first case they lay out is the most ideal. In this one, you take the COVID-19 test 72 hours before your arrival in Hawaii. You get the results before you leave. The results are negative. You travel to Hawaii. You present the declaration form that we'll talk about in just a moment. In that case, they admit you to Hawaii. They'll ask you to minimize your interactions with people, but then in that case, there's no state restrictions. The second case is you take the test before you leave, you don't get the test results, but you still go ahead and travel anyway. Well, when you get to Hawaii, you will have to quarantine until you get the results, and then if the results come in once you're in Hawaii and you're quarantined and you're negative from those results, then you can go about your journey. No state restrictions. The third case they lay out is you don't take a test, you travel to Hawaii anyway. Well, in that case, you'll have to quarantine for 14 days, but then after that, 14 days, no state restrictions. Now, they do point out that if you're tested positive at any time while you're in the state of Hawaii, you will need to quarantine, and if you feel symptoms at any time, you should go ahead and get tested. So if you're planning a trip to Hawaii, you should plan some slack in your schedule so that you've got the money and the time to be in quarantine if that happens to you. Now, this declaration form that I mentioned, Hawaii's actually moved this form online, and you're supposed to fill it out 24 hours prior to departure. It's a questionnaire, asks you some information about your health, where you're going to be staying. You get a QR code once you fill it out, and then you can bring that and show it either on your phone or you can print it out and scan it once you get there. Hawaii is also asking all visitors to have a charged and working cell phone when they arrive in Hawaii so that you can give them your phone number on arrival and they can test it to make sure they can reach you. That's how they check in with you if you're quarantined. The fifth thing to note is who needs to get tested. This applies to everyone. Everybody needs to get tested on arrival if they want to avoid the 14-day quarantine. Doesn't matter the person's age, 0 months to 120 years. And if you're older than 120 years and you're traveling to Hawaii, that's amazing. I want to meet you, but it still applies to you as well. In addition to applying to visitors to Hawaii, it also applies to Hawaii residents. So if Hawaii residents visit the mainland and then they want to come back and not be quarantined, they have to get the COVID-19 test before they return to Hawaii. Number 6, what happens if you're quarantined? Well, essentially the state is going to ask you to not leave your lodging, whether that's your hotel, your Airbnb, or the house that you're staying in. And when they say not leave your lodging in a hotel, they actually mean not leave the hotel room. They don't mean walk around the property. They mean stay in the hotel room, get room service, get groceries delivered. The state of Hawaii is considering this thing called resort bubbles, and actually the island of Kauai has been approved for resort bubble. And if you're in a resort bubble, then even in quarantine, you actually could walk around and enjoy the resort amenities. In that case, you would be required to wear a monitoring bracelet while you're in quarantine so that the state can track you. While this has been approved, there have been no resorts announced that are going to be taking advantage of this resort bubble in quarantine. If there are any resorts announced for that, I will add them to the pinned comment as well. Number 7, what about testing on arrival? Well, if you watched my video from a couple months ago about how Hawaii is considering to reopen, one of the things they said about how they're considering to reopen would be doing tests on arrival. Well, currently that will not be available in the first phase of this program because Hawaii feels they do not have enough internal testing capacity for local Hawaii residents, and so they didn't want visitor arrivals to impact local testing, and so in the first phase of this program, all testing to get out of quarantine needs to be done before you depart for Hawaii. The state has said that they intend to look into testing on arrival in future phases, perhaps when there are speedier and easier COVID-19 tests available. Number 8, what about international travelers? This still doesn't really help international travelers. There's a bunch of countries that are currently banned from traveling into the US. If you've been in China, the EU, UK, Ireland, or Brazil in the last 14 days and you're not a US citizen, you currently can't travel into the United States of America. Now, if you're located in another country that can travel into the US, well, it has to be one that has a CVS or one of their other contracted travel partners. Since they haven't announced the full list, it's hard to tell, but right now they've said they're primarily targeting travelers from the mainland USA, and that's where they're contracting the testing facilities. Now, I assume one way you could do it if you wanted to visit Hawaii would be to travel first to the mainland US, someplace like Los Angeles. When you're in Los Angeles, then go to a CVS, get tested before you get to Hawaii. That's the way you could get a test at one of the approved facilities. If you're Number 9, what's going to be open when you get to Hawaii? That's a great question, and there's not really a very good answer. In the press conference with the governor of Hawaii, he said the decisions about what is actually open versus who can travel are driven at different levels of the government. The decision about who can come to the state of Hawaii is by the state government, and then the decision about what things are open and stay-at-home orders are driven at the county or the city level. And so I don't know what's actually going to be open when you go to Hawaii. Now, if you want to pick an island that'll probably have the most things open, well, Kauai currently has no active COVID-19 cases, so Kauai is probably a pretty good bet. Oahu has the most active COVID-19 cases, and likely Oahu will then have the most restrictions. Now, what about inter-island travel or island hopping? Currently, Hawaii also has a inter-island travel quarantine, so people traveling between Hawaiian islands need to quarantine for 14 days. That quarantine order is set to expire on October 15th, so assuming that expires then, that'll be the same time that this takes effect, and then that shouldn't be an issue. I will say pay attention when you're going to make sure that that inter-island quarantine order has lifted, assuming that you wanted to island hop when you get to Hawaii. Now, the 10th thing to know is that I'll be putting out more updates as this story progresses. Clearly, there's a lot of things we know, but there's also a lot of things we don't know. And as Hawaii puts out more information, I'll be putting out new videos to update all of you that have had to put your Hawaii plans on hold until Hawaii reopens. Now, if you are planning a trip to Hawaii, you might want to enjoy checking out some of my other videos on Hawaii. I've got playlists on Oahu, Maui, and Kauai, and definitely subscribe if you're not so you stay tuned for future updates on Hawaii's reopening. As usual, I won't say goodbye because I'll see you in the next video.